Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Professor Reichlin. I'm a professor at London Business School, and welcome everybody to our third webinar on the subject of disclosure, data, and infrastructure related to the climate transition here at the Wheeler Institute at London Business School. Today, the main speaker is Clara Barby. Hello, Clara. Welcome. Clara is a senior partner at Just Climate, and thanks, Clara, to be with us today. Before I introduce you properly, let me also say that there will be another speaker with us today, Thijs van der Gaag, who will help me moderating the Q&A sessions. Thijs is a LBS MBA 2023 student. She has worked in technology consulting in the US for the last 5 years. She's very interested in exploring innovative multi-stakeholder solution to address climate change. So that's a good place to be, Thijs, today with us and with Clara in particular. And at London Business School, Thijs is also on the executive committee of the student-led Energy and Environmental Club and serves as an LBS student ambassador. A few words about the Wheeler Institute before I start. The Wheeler has been established with the generous support of Tony and Maureen Wheeler, founders of Lonely Planet, and is an institute that seeks to apply business expertise to social and economic challenges in emerging markets and low-income countries. The Wheeler also organizes speeches and events, and we thank the Wheeler for hosting, our series on climate. A few words on housekeeping. The webinar will last 1 hour. We will start with a conversation between Clara and I, followed by 20 minutes of Q&As. Be aware of the fact that the Q&A function is enabled, and so feel free to submit your question throughout the webinar. So we will do our best then to give everybody space and try to aggregate the questions. So I will moderate the first part, and then at 14:40 I will give the floor to Thijs, who will actually moderate the Q&As. Okay, so let's start then, Clara. It's a pleasure to have you here. And, I just want to start by saying that, you have had a very important role in the development of the project that we have been talking about with Emmanuel Faber in the first webinar, and then with Ronnie Cohen in the second webinar. So to the establishment of the Sustainability Standard Board, the International Sustainability Standard Board under the umbrella of the FRS. Indeed, the two of us worked for about a year on this project. Many would say that without your support and your management, that project would have never took off. When you started working at the FRS on this project, you were CEO of the Impact Management Project. And this is a project that began in 2016 as a forum for building global consensus on how to measure, assess, and report impacts on people and the natural environment. So that project had a broader remit than just reporting and disclosure. So I would be very much interested in having you to talk about it today with us. But before we get there, as usual, I would like to start with a little bit more of a personal question. So what has been your journey? I mean, how did you get to be interested in taking a leading role on sustainability? You started with a degree in classic from Oxford, and then you got an MBA from INSEAD. You have been a partner at Bridges Fund Management, which is the fund that Ronnie co-founded. In fact, we talked about that with Ronnie last week. And then since January, you have been senior partner of Just Climate. So why don't we, so you have done a lot of things. And why don't we start with the Impact Management Project, and why don't you try to describe to us what was the concept of facilitating and aggregating, helping aggregate and putting different projects in contact, within the impact management project.
Great. Lucrezia, thank you first of all for having me, and to the Wheeler Institute as well. It's very easy to look back at your past and attribute great logic to how everything unfolded. I think there are two really big observations though from the work I've been doing that really led to the impact management project in the first instance, which included the culmination in the work with you last year to establish the International Sustainability Standards Board, but then also to Just Climate, where I am now. And so I'll come on to talk about Just Climate later on, I think. But in terms of the big observations that got me to this point, the two are, the first one was, and I hope that people on this call, if you've ever worked in a company or an asset manager, you will have found that this was also the case. We found, Lucrezia, if you go back, I've been in sustainable and impact investment for nearly 2 decades now. And when you go back kind of, 18 years, what was happening in the market was people were competing not on who had the best impact performance, if you will, but rather who had the best way of measuring and managing it. I remember these slide decks that both companies that we looked to invest in, but also, ourselves and our peers in asset management, we were using these slide decks, and you'd get to this slide, in a pitch that said, and here is our innovative, differentiated measurement methodology. And I used to joke with colleagues, can you imagine looking at a company's pitch deck or an asset management pitch deck, and there's a slide that you arrive at and it says, here is our innovative, differentiated approach to financial accounting. And we all used to laugh. And it was sort of funny, but not funny. It was a real moment of recognizing that actually, if this whole area is going to mature, we have to get to a point where we don't compete on methodology, we compete on performance. And so the impact management project was born out of that recognition. And it was initially a group of really progressive companies and asset managers. We had everyone from Mars, the multinational corporation, through to frontline social enterprises and charities, to governments, but also mainstream asset managers and owners. And it was this smaller group initially that was saying, surely if we bring the best of our approaches together, we could at least, in a market-driven way, take some steps towards something that's common across all of us, and then we can start to compete on performance. And so that was the origin of it. And we were very cognizant at the time, Lucrezia, that there were already standard setters who were tackling different pieces of the puzzle. So one of the other observations that led to the IMP coming together was that often people were comparing apples, pears, and bananas. So they were saying, all of these alphabet soup acronyms, it's too many. And it was an absolutely fair criticism that within that large soup, some of the acronyms were genuinely overlapping, perhaps competing with each other. But actually, in many cases, the reality was that they were tackling different pieces of the puzzle. And so if you take, for example, disclosures that were focused on metrics, and then you think about other organizations working on best practices in governance, for example, and other organizations still who were working on underlying methodologies that ultimately a disclosure standard would then use. You need all of those things. And if you think about our sort of financial system, we very much understand the different pieces of the puzzle, and we don't conflate, a P&L and balance sheet with valuation with good practices in financial management. We recognize that they all relate to each other and we need all of them. So those were the observations that led to the IMP coming about. The only other observation I'll mention from my past, because later on it really underlies kind of the direction of travel for me to go from all of that to Just Climate, was that at the level of an investor, which is my background, all asset management, looking at, okay, if we had this common way of measuring and managing, and then we were actually competing on performance, how are we doing when it comes to the crisis of climate change? And that's the other thing that has driven my career. I started out in investing in hydro, solar, biomass in emerging markets, and it was niche back then. And I watched what happened in climate finance, particularly over the last decade. And I was acutely aware that while all of this market infrastructure was building up, we were seeing climate finance flows increase. And when I say climate finance, I mean very specifically the allocation from capital markets to actually investing in solutions. So renewable energy is an obvious one. We've seen electric vehicles really get a lot of investment this year. But what we weren't seeing, and this is really the logic for Just Climate, was differentiation within that solutions universe, and recognizing that actually not all solutions are created equal, and we have very little time left to halve emissions. Everyone focuses on net zero 2050. And that's for really good reasons, because that's our real deadline. But actually, we have a nearer deadline of 2030 because we're running up a down escalator. And so if we don't hit the 2030 deadline, which is to halve emissions, then there's just no hope at all of getting to the 2050 one. And so that's only 8 years away. And one of the things we can talk about later on is, I do think, having worked in climate and sustainable finance for a long time, we now need to take this data, this performance information, and start thinking about how capital markets can actually invest in the highest abating solutions, the things that are really going to shift the dial. And actually, it's not the ones that are often talked about. It's cement, it's green cement, it's green steel production, it's waste to biofuel. It's probably the less sexy of the sectors, if I'm honest, but it's the ones that we really now need to focus on. So those are the big drivers from my past that got me to where we are now.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about the impact management there, how that project, it is now off, right? So it started in 2016, but it has transformed itself in something else, if I understand.
Yes, exactly.
So that you would be interested
exactly.
to have the.
Well, so yeah, no, so the IMP as a project. We got to the point where two things needed to happen, Lucrezia. And the first one was the work that I had the privilege of doing with you and the IFRS Foundation trustees, which was that the disclosure space was ready for, at least when it came to disclosure for global capital markets, moving to the next level into a formalized model with the governance of the monitoring board that the IFRS has, which has the securities regulators and other government representatives on it, through to the IFRS Foundation. That was one really important step for the disclosure work that was ready to take last year. But the rest of impact management standards, which I will talk about in a minute, I want to unpack what impact management is for you. But the rest of the standards still need more work. That it's not as though the IFRS is everything. It's a very specific piece of impact management, which is disclosure to investors. There are a host of other standards that we need to have a more sustainable world.
And can you give us an example? So since we talked about disclosure, but yeah.
Yes, exactly. So a good example would be, we need, and it may not be a standard, it may be framed as guidance. So one of the things I don't want to trip up on is the language here. There are frameworks, there are standards, there are principles. We see all of them. I don't want to spend your webinar getting into the fine detail on the differences, but it's that universe I'm talking about. And an example of, I think, where we don't yet have a consistent framework for best practice would be transition plans. So disclosure standards are never going to tell us what a good transition plan looks like, because disclosure standards are designed to create transparency, not to prescribe what good is. We still need, as companies and asset managers, to know what good is, to know how we can be guided to do this well, and then we will disclose what it is we are doing.
Isn't this the job of public policy to guide on what is a good transition plan as opposed to a bad transition plan?
Yes, so very good question. So a friend of mine always says that the reality is that there's a dance between market and policy. And I think when it comes to transition plans, good transition plans, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing actually the market move first in some instance, and then policy catch up, and then the market might go further. And so I think it is that constant dance we'll see. But I think broadly speaking, to your point, yes, there is no question that public policy has a huge role to play in determining what good looks like in many aspects of impact management. Would it be useful for me to talk about what that term means, though, because I know you've had speakers that have talked about measurement. So there's really three concepts which I guess I would love to highlight. They're quite personal to me in terms of where I think we need to do more, and they really speak to the difference between management overall and what you might think of as disclosures. So the first one is thresholds. People throw out the terms positive impact and negative impact as though it's a given that you know whether an impact's positive or negative, or you know how positive or how negative it is. And of course it's not. So understanding a company's impacts means measuring the changes in well-being of people or the conditions of natural resources that the company's activities are causing. And there's a lot of work being done on, is it causing or is it contributing to? So we can unpack that perhaps, but it's understanding that relative to what constitutes good enough that gives you insight. And it's only when you have that threshold for what constitutes good enough, which is widely known as a societal or ecological threshold, that you know whether performance is negative and therefore unsustainable, or whether it's positive and therefore sustainable. So if you take climate as an example, we have the concept of a 1.5 degree world. And from that end, we're able to determine allocation methodologies, organization-specific targets based on science about what constitutes good enough to deliver that world. And to your point on policy, Lucrezia, it is absolutely right to say that it is policy convergence that has driven that clarity for us. So that's an example of an ecological threshold that you need to manage.
Okay, if I can, when we think about impact, of course, there is impact with respect to an objective that can be net zero or whatever target you have. But then impact has different, could be impact, could be different for different group of people in society, for different communities and so on. So
yeah.
How do you deal with that problem? And if you, maybe it's impossible to deal with that problem without, much more connection with public.
So it's, I think for the practitioners doing the work, what you've asked is probably the single most challenging aspect of it, because it's not only the differences that you might get between what's often referred to as cohorts of individuals. It's also the extent to which you're able to actually measure the outcome as experienced by them. So even within a given group, if you had access to, if you only had one cohort to deal with, which is rarely the case, it's a question of, well, how do I know I'm actually measuring the change in well-being? And what typically happens, of course, is that you have a proxy measure for that. And there's some evidence of a causal link between the two. So the best way to get at what you're describing is to be able to communicate directly with different cohorts of people experiencing something and get that information, primary data, in effect. But as you know very well, and I'm humble about saying this to you, Lucrezia, because of all of your work with data. But I mean, in reality, doing that, you can imagine that the scale of some of these companies and certainly the scale of the capital markets, that direct interaction with cohorts of individuals is unrealistic. So what tends to happen, of course, is that you get a combination of tools being used. And it might be that you use evidence from a study about the experience of a particular cohort, what that's likely to be based on a particular set of outputs of a business, and you use that to make assumptions. But what's so important in impact management is that you know that you're doing that. So there's a phrase people use, which is enough precision for the decision. You've got to know, how accurate does the data need to be for me to make the best decision given this context? So I think you've absolutely touched on one of the hardest bits of this.
So coming to the hard bits. So what do you think are the biggest challenge in this area? So that in your experience, yes.
So I think there's one which is not a challenge, but it's a perception issue, and I find it comes up a lot, and it's when you hear this framing of inside out versus outside in. So often you hear people talk about a company's impacts on, society and the natural environment versus how society and the natural environment affect a company. And I think that conceptually can cause people to trip up because it misrepresents this idea of circularity, the idea that there's a causal loop between the impacts that a business has on its stakeholders and the fact that it depends on those stakeholders. And so the well-being of them, and if it's a natural resource, the condition of that natural resource, whether it's a local, the water availability in the location of the company's factories, for example, it depends on those. And so those in turn then create risks and opportunities for the business and for investors. And so that circularity, that loop, is incredibly important to understand, because actually impact management is, from the internal perspective of a business, is about understanding those impacts, how the company then depends on the stakeholders it's affecting, and then using that to improve. And I just wanted to emphasize that on the challenges side, because I think when you look at disclosure, one of the things that is going to be so important in the months and years ahead is that where you have disclosure standards that are speaking to investors, and you have disclosure standards that are speaking to a range of other stakeholders, there's a recognition that actually impact measurement, that understanding of carbon emissions relative to science-based targets, water relative to local water basin and availability, wages relative to real living wage, that's a performance relative to a threshold in each case. And it's that same data that is relevant to a variety of different stakeholders. And I think that's why we need to make sure that disclosure standards speak to each other. So that's the first challenge I would highlight. Another one, I think, is that we do need to see proper integration. So when I think about what's happening in the field of impact management, there was a really good reason why at the time, and how everything is always solved for in terms of what do we need at this moment in time to move the needle on an issue. And when impact management as a concept was born, it was because we already had financial management. And so, there was a whole field of organizations, from the IASB to the CFA Institute, et cetera, who worked on providing those frameworks and standards to guide that. We didn't have the equivalent all joined up and explained for managing companies' impacts and dependencies on people and natural resources. And so that's why there was this big push. But what we now need is the two to come back together and to recognize that actually companies then integrate all of that. And at the end of the day, the board, its governance, its strategy, its risk management is looking at everything in an integrated way, acknowledging that circularity. And so I hope that that's the word we now get to. It really ought to be integrated management rather than
this idea of integration, came out also very clearly from our conversation with Emmanuel and with Ronnie. But London Business School, of course, is an educational, it's a university. So in terms of the skills that that you need in this area, so what exactly do you need? Because this is not strategy and finance and accounting as we traditionally think about it, right? But it is something that. So, what would you say, from your experience in the market?
So, you're right that it's not business as usual at the moment. I think that it's not as different though as some people think. So I want to be very sensitive now and say that really understanding impact experience by different cohorts of people, and obviously natural resource condition, is, I say with humility that requires a great deal of skill. And you get very quickly into issues around how to listen if you're dealing with issues around people's well-being, etc. So there is a whole skill set there, which actually organizations who've been working in development, for example, or in the field of evaluation, are very used to that skill. And there's a lot that can be learned from them by people working in businesses. But there's another aspect, which actually I do think is pretty similar to business as usual, and we just need to start treating it that way, which is how we collect information, and we do it with as much rigor as possible. We think about how we assure it, and critically, we embed it in our internal control systems as companies. And then it goes up to the board and is really integrated at that board level in decision making, and then of course in reporting. And if you think about it, one of the great transitions we're seeing now is the shift from this sort of sustainability team within a company to actually it sitting underneath the CFO. And in some instances, we're even seeing a CFO recharacterized as a chief value officer, to recognize that actually, to a certain extent, they're very good at this idea of collecting data from the company, you know, from customers up, from suppliers up, obviously from operations, and then bringing it all together. We need that same system to be used, Lucrezia. We've got to embed all of this into that system. And of course, we have to have assurance happen in the same way as we've seen it with financial accounting audit. So I am hopeful that there are new skills to bring in, and we need to learn from development and evaluation, but equally there's a lot of infrastructure we can build on. We already have.
Now, you know, the Wheeler has a specific emphasis and focus on emerging markets and you know, low-income countries. So this movement, which in aspiration is global, how do you think it will resonate in countries which are less mature, or on smaller companies, SMEs, and so on, which will not have the capabilities of supporting such projects?
So it's really interesting that people often say, I've heard two different versions. One is the big companies, the multinationals with all of the resources, are the only ones that are going to be able to do this well. The other argument I've heard runs completely counter to that. And that is that the big companies are never going to be able to do this well because they don't know who is in their various tiers of suppliers, for example. And so even having that information is something they're struggling with. So how on earth will they get it? And actually the ones that are well positioned to do this are SMEs embedded in local communities who know the farmers that they source from, for example, or know their customers in a given city or town. And so you hear these two very different narratives. And of course, as always, the answer is somewhere between the two. I do think that, you know, there's some very interesting work going on in some of the big corporates who are recognizing that, and this goes to the heart of this idea of enough precision for the decision. When it comes to climate, we need to be really careful not to try and get, if you take something like scope 3, which I suspect Emmanuel and Ronnie both touched on, you know, if you take disclosures around scope 3, it's really important that we don't.
Can you just repeat, just for our audience, just define what scope 3 is?
Yeah, so scope 3 is the most difficult data to get, typically speaking, because it's either end of your value chain. So it's not information that you typically from assets that you control or that you buy. So for example, it's not the emissions from your own operations or the energy that you buy, it's the emissions created through use of your products or through your supply chain. And so it can be very difficult to get that information because of the range of customers and uses of products on the one end, and then of course the tiers of suppliers on the other. But what I think people are recognizing, and it really goes back to this idea of 2030, we've got to halve emissions, that is 8 years away. We cannot lose sight of, therefore, the need to have data that's just about good enough. And so I think there's some really interesting things happening with corporates where they're saying, well, we have the resources we can put into modeling. You know, this is what actually we think is likely to arise from these kinds of suppliers in these locations. And then being able to provide that information to their suppliers so that they do not have to, you know, invest in things that may take them 8 years even to get the systems into place. So that's the sort of creativity that we need when it comes to something as difficult as scope 3. When it comes to scope 1, for example, we need to leverage those internal control systems we've already got in many, many companies. And of course, we need standards to underpin it, because that's really going to stop people spending time on trying to have the best methodology or trying to figure it out, and just be able to say, I know what to do, let's get on with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's very interesting. So why don't we talk a little bit about your new job? You know, your job is very, very recent. What is Just Climate?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I said that two things have driven my career when I look back on it. And one was the obsession with let's compete on performance, not method. The other was this recognition that not all solutions are created equal. And so just to step right back, I suppose, Lucrezia, for those listening who are looking at how do you integrate climate into capital markets overall, a lot of the conversation with investors has been quite rightly about on the three tools that investors have, which is really how do they measure and assess climate information and take it into account? How do they engage using shareholder activism, for example, or through board seats if you're in private markets, and through how they actually choose to allocate, so divestment and then allocating to solutions. Those are the three tools investors have. And a lot of the dialogue so far about integrating climate has obviously focused on climate disclosure, which is the assess piece. It is certainly focused on engagement, and we've seen shareholder activism really dial up in public markets. And on allocation, it is rightly, to a certain extent, focused on the divestment conversation, on an argument about should we stop financing, how can we get capital markets to stop financing incremental fossil fuels? Where I think there has been less push, and what Just Climate was really set up to address, was within allocating to solutions. So if you think about any multi-asset class portfolio of an investor, I hope that they're going to do, if they're not already, all of the things I've just described. But when they then think about how do I also allocate very intentionally to a set of solutions to climate change, so not just investments that are going to decrease their carbon footprint, but are actually going to provide solutions that will enable other assets to decrease their carbon footprint. And examples I gave before are renewables and electric vehicles, but we've also got solutions like how do we green the cement manufacturing process? How do we green steel production? Buildings are a huge source of emissions. So in that, how do we get investors to look at all of those solutions and say, actually, I need to allocate to those? And
this is mostly about technology, for some of it.
You're absolutely right that technology underpins it. So if we don't have the technologies that can either enable us to avoid or remove carbon, in the case of carbon capture, then there isn't even a conversation about solutions. But what Just Climate has been set up to address is the problem is actually at this point, not that we don't have the technologies. So we actually have quite a lot of technologies, and they've even in some cases been proven. So actually what we're seeing is quite a lot of technologies have been de-risked. But what's not happening is that very first big commercial demonstration. So if I take something like steel, there are technologies that allow for greening of the steel production process. And steel production is about 8% of emissions globally. So really big contributor. But no one has done the big first demonstrations of that then allow you to say, there's no reason why we can't go from one huge plant to 20 to 50, and suddenly you have industry transformation. And so Just Climate's been set up to say, how do we bring institutional capital? So this is mainstream capital markets, and say we want investors to continue decarbonizing their portfolios and engaging on transition plans, and we want them to continue allocating to solutions. But within solutions, we now really want investors to say, how do I have the highest carbon abatement per dollar invested? What are those solutions? And so we're looking at Just Climate for that set of solutions. And then we're saying, okay, how do we use all of the tools of impact management to find that opportunity set and then to manage it so that we really do get obviously appropriate market returns, but also this highest positive impact per dollar invested. So
this is your job. I mean, you run around the world to find those solutions.
So I don't run around the world because that would create a lot of emissions, but we have hired it's worth me just explaining that Just Climate is new, but not new. So it is a business that's been established by Generation Investment Management, which is, has about a 20-year track record in sustainable investing. And so it's not new at all in that respect. It's very much part of an established platform. And what we're doing with it, though, is saying Generation's heritage is really research. It's a very research-driven firm, and it really made the case for sustainable investing by using research to drive choices in public equities and then growth. This new business, which is part of the group, has the same research process. So we very much start with, the difference with Just Climate, though, is that we are looking at that potential for highest carbon abatement. And so, yes, there is a team here, Lucrezia, that are doing that work. And then obviously the question we're asking as investors is, how do we structure the right financial package to make it work? And I think in a nutshell, the challenge of it has been historically that a lot of these solutions that exist but now need demonstrating at scale they're typically too big for venture. They're really capable of absorbing quite a lot of capital. They are too asset heavy for private equity, which for reasons to do with IRR and the life of those funds chase asset light deals more often. And they're too nascent for your classic infrastructure fund. So we're really interested in plugging that gap and saying, actually, we need to think more creatively about asset allocation, because there's real opportunity in this set of investments.
And do you also have contribution from governments, or is just private capital?
No, at the moment it is private capital in terms of founding investors, although we have a government sovereign wealth fund in the mix as well. So we do anticipate, that kind of profile where you've got sovereign wealth funds or pension funds that are government in origin. But what is nice about Just Climate as a firm is it has been set up with an objective of making the case for what we call climate-led investing. And so it is a bigger objective than, often a typical private sector firm might have. So I do envisage us working very closely with policy agendas in that respect, because one of the things that I'm really encouraged by is, in addition to the progress that I think was made on disclosure with the G7 and G20, there was also an acknowledgement that we need private sector mobilization of capital. And it very much fits with that agenda, Lucrezia.
And it seems to me that this is particularly important in Europe, where the capital market is very underdeveloped. And so that we need, new ideas and new initiatives. So is it very much a US focus, your fund?
No, it's global. We will have an allocation to emerging markets in the first fund as well. So it's very much global. And we're really interested more in that common denominator being this highest carbon abatement potential rather than geography as a concentration. So I think we have to think globally. I mean, it's not by accident that it's called Just Climate. One of the things when I was giving examples when we were talking about impact management is I always find it hard to give examples, because one of the secrets of good management is that you recognize the interdependencies between different kinds of people or natural resources. So Just Climate is a very deliberate name to recognize that just transition matters to get to climate. And it's quite interesting. I have often been asked recently, what are the just climate, sorry, what are the just transition metrics? So often people will say, what are the disclosures for that? And I do think, and this is a longer conversation, but I do think that actually just transition is not a set of metrics. There absolutely will be measures and disclosures that I think will coalesce around as a market, but it's really one of process and governance, and saying who is involved, who makes the decisions, and whose perspective is driving the decisions. And so that's a sort of founding principle, if you will, of what we're trying to do. So it's very deliberately global in that sense.
Very exciting, very good. So you're having fun, I hope.
Yes, no, I am. It's a very nice bringing together of the asset management, which was my starting point, and obviously all of the work I was able to do. And I am delighted that the IFRS will lead, but not be limited to a climate standard. Yes.
Yeah. So that's the next frontier for the IFRS. Okay. So, I mean, we have done our 40 minutes. So, Tess, I think you should take the floor now and manage the Q&As from the floor. Go ahead.
Yep. All right. Thanks so much. Okay. Hey, everyone. All right, Clara, we do have a couple of questions that came through our chat, so we'll address those first. And thank you so much for your participation so far. So the first question we have here is, could you share your views on the recent energy crisis and how this might impact efforts on carbon management in the future?
Yes, I mean, I find that what's happening is people are taking the crisis and back to this idea of two competing narratives. I think different people are looking at it and then drawing conclusions to suit their agenda, if you will. So there's absolutely a conclusion people are drawing that this is only going to increase fracking and investing in incremental fossil fuels because of national security of energy. But equally, there are people, and I sympathize with this perspective, and I think it's and not or, who recognize that, you know, if you were to take all of the energy that you could put into, and I shouldn't say energy because it's going to confuse you, if you were to take all of the effort that you would put into revitalizing, for example, fossil fuel development in some of these markets that are now looking at protecting energy sources locally, and pour that instead into really dialing up the green energy agenda, you know, you might get to the better outcome overall. And so obviously I sympathize with that view, that I think we are on the right side of history when it comes to the green agenda. I really do think that even if we see the incremental carbon emissions in the very near term because of the reaction in the medium term, this is only going to lead us to double down as a world on a different infrastructure for global energy, which is one that is green and takes into account national security.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. So another question that we have that came through is this participant wanted to know, could you help clarify why a new impact lens is needed or new, and how to make it tangible, since this person finds it hard to believe that, you know, impact and shareholder management is bringing more clarity to investors, that they think that it actually might be bringing more like less clarity to investors.
And forgive me, I just need to double check the question. Do you mean why a new approach to impact measurement, or a new investing strategy? Because those are fundamentally different things. So I just want to make sure I answer the question.
Yeah, I think let's try with maybe the strategy. That's my read of this question.
So because the way that, I mean, the easiest way of answering that is really what I was saying before, which is that I don't think we need a new maybe it is a new investing strategy. It's incremental though, it's not an alternative. So when it comes to climate finance, as I said, we're seeing growth in it. It's not nearly enough. So if you look at UNEP figures, it went from 600 billion to 900 billion last year, which is obviously quite significant growth. But UNEP predicts that we need 3 to up to 6 times that per year to get to the 2030 target. So in and of itself, it's just not nearly enough overall. Within that, the point I was making is that those flows need to continue going where they're going, which is renewables, for example, electric vehicles, wind, solar, etc. But we need them to also go to the sectors they're not going to. So quite a stark statistic that's driven me was recognition that of the money that's currently flowing, the sectors for which there are solutions which create over 50% of the emissions, and that is the steel, cement, waste to biofuels, it's all the things I was describing before. They're creating over 50% of the emissions, but they're only getting under 10% of the capital, particularly if you include natural capital solutions in that, so regenerative agriculture, etc. And that's a mismatch. If we have only 10% of the capital going to the things that are creating over 50% of the emissions, we need to solve for that. And whether we solve for that by calling it a tint on an existing strategy, or we describe it as an additional strategy, is a conversation we can have about framing. But that's really what I was trying to get at. We need to make sure that the appropriate share of the climate finance pie is going to the sectors that are creating the most emissions.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So that might tie to this next question, which is, in your role at Just Climate, what is your biggest obstacle in trying to create a new climate transition as an asset class?
The biggest obstacle? I think that the biggest obstacle is that it doesn't fit into traditional allocation buckets. So for anyone listening who's really used to working with strategic asset allocation and thinking about, I have equities and bonds, and then I have private markets, and I have growth, and I have venture capital, and I have infrastructure. I was describing before, it doesn't fit neatly into any of those buckets because it's too big for venture, it's too asset heavy for growth typically, and it's too nascent for infrastructure. So that for me is the biggest challenge. And we're seeing different approaches. So some investors are carving out a decarbonization sleeve to solve for that, and actually having almost a kind of complementary allocation that's focused on decarbonization, which allows them to play across mixes of asset classes. Other investors are saying, actually, I view this as real assets, private real assets, and I actually think this is the growth end of real assets, and it's really interesting in that context. So we're seeing investors look at it in different ways to suit their needs, but it remains an obstacle because anything unconventional is always an obstacle in the early phase. It usually then is seen as an opportunity, which is what I hope will happen.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, and then another question that we have here, is there a key priority for developing countries in integrating environmental and climate objectives in recovery responses to COVID?
Can you repeat the question? Is there a key response?
A key priority. For,
at Just Climate as a firm?
I think in general, but maybe, yeah, how you could shed light on how Just Climate is thinking about this too.
So, I mean, in terms of how investors are reacting to COVID, I mean, I don't want to make grand claims about how the overall capital markets are reacting. I certainly can say that within the impact investing community, lots of organizations have done good work and have shared it publicly in terms of how they've created responses specifically to COVID. Within what we're doing, I actually see this as, again, it's much like just transition overall. I don't think there is a box of COVID metrics that you will measure, COVID relevant metrics. I think it really depends on how COVID has then created local, issues locally. And it's a question of working with local stakeholders to understand how to take that into account in a climate-led investment context. So it's very much case by case in that respect. We don't have anything that we would say is blanket to do with COVID. I would be interested to know if people think about it differently, and I would love to have a dialogue on it.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you so much. And we are still getting some questions coming in here. So another question is, what do you think are the key factors contributing to that mismatch between carbon emissions and capital investment?
Oh, the mismatch. I think that one of the issues is often it's about, Lucrezia made the important point about technology, right? There's this about technologies, and I was saying, well, actually what we're finding is that quite often the technology does exist. It just hasn't been done at the scale that you need for this then to be considered a proper kind of, we can roll this out, and ultimately infrastructure, for example, could fund it. That in some cases what we find is that the technology exists, but it hasn't necessarily been put together in the business model. So if you take something like green steel, it's the different elements that you need across the steel production process have each individually been de-risked, but they've never been all put together at scale in one plant. And so some of the barriers are actually about having on your investment team people who can understand that and address that risk. So we, quite unusually, for example, our investment team has someone who is, we have an engineer. We have people who look at things. They're not investors. They come at our deals looking at it from the perspective as engineers, and how can we look at technology risk, and actually where it's not really risk, it's to do with bringing things together and aspects like that. We also have, quite unusually, a team that combines growth equity experience with credit and project equity and project financing. Again, you don't usually have that all in one team, but what we're finding, again, because it tends to be this mix that you need, it doesn't fit neatly into an allocation, is that we need that mix of skills on the team. It's very deliberate.
Okay, thank you so much. Oops. Clara, go ahead.
No, I had a question on my own, Clara. I mean, about financial innovation in this area, okay, instruments. it seems to me that, you know, if the problem is scale, I mean, that, you know, there are ways in which finance in the past has dealt with these problems. Is there anything new, you know, from a purely financial point of view, you know, of financial innovative instruments to deal with some of these challenges?
I think we definitely need them, Lucrezia. The challenge with something like blended finance, for example, you know, often you see structures that are innovative in the sense that different participants in the capital stack, you know, you might mix public sector guarantees, for example, with private sector. I think we're definitely going to need more of that type of instrument, but the challenge with it always is transaction costs. You know, often I've seen really brilliant blended finance structures put together, but they're quite difficult to replicate and were very expensive to get all of the participants aligned. And so we need to both think about that and continue to push on it, but really bear in mind that at this point, again, because we've only got 8 years, that for me is the time frame we need to talk about. We have to have almost that commodity angle on things as we're creating them. You know, the strategy that we're developing here at Just Climate is very much with that view of, can this be commoditized? Could you imagine every traditional investment mandate having this within its asset allocation is the mindset that we have because of the need to scale so fast.
It's a big challenge.
Yeah, it's a really big challenge.
Yes, back to you.
Yes, sounds great, thank you. So we have another question here. To what extent do you think boards are making business decisions holistically versus separate decisions for commercial and impact concerns? Are there integrated metrics that you think will be critical to making more joint decisions?
So I don't think we're there yet, Sana. I mean, I'm not the only one obviously saying that. I think everyone's worried that that's where the rubber hits the road, is that critical board decision. It's why in disclosures, you know, I didn't spend time on disclosure too much earlier because you've very much had those webinars already, but you know, I've had the privilege of working with a lot of the people working in disclosure, and whether you're talking to GRI or you're talking to the organizations that have consolidated into the ISSB, they all are talking about governance as a critical part of the disclosure framework. So I think everyone knows that it starts there, and ultimately that's where you need that integration. The challenge we have is, I think, less about the board per se and more about incentives. And I do think that one area we need to talk more about is how can we have incentive structures that are truly integrated, and that, you know, I'm not suggesting that the pendulum should swing all the other way, that suddenly we shouldn't incentivize for financial performance at all. I think it's about integration, it's about the blend. We have here for our first product, we do have an incentive mechanism that has the traditional financial incentive mechanism coupled with an adjustment for carbon abatement. So we've done it very deliberately to try and correct for incentives that otherwise might not solve for the problem we've set out to solve for. And I hope that will be something we can have a dialogue with others about, because I do think it's the incentive bit we have to crack. And it was really interesting thinking about, you know, when we create that incentive that adjusts for carbon abatement, who are we doing that for? And, you know, because you could argue that we're a mission-driven organization looking to play our part in helping with net zero. And so, of course, for us as individuals, this matters. But actually, if you look at why people are allocating to products that are trying to both deliver appropriate market returns, but also abate the most carbon per dollar invested, it's being driven by at least 3 different reasons, which are really interesting from a kind of economic imperative perspective, as well as a moral imperative. And so the first one we find is that people are recognizing that a basket of assets like this, actually, if the incentive mechanism is for the team to provide that return with the highest carbon abatement, it automatically means you're going to end up with a basket of assets that are really well positioned if we see a messy, inevitable policy response. in terms of carbon pricing, in terms of re-rating of sectors, it's going to be very well positioned. So that's your more classic argument. There's then an argument about what is increasingly called system level stewardship. So we're seeing asset owners with very long-term liabilities on the balance sheet, recognizing that if they don't have an allocation to this kind of product in the mix, then they're so exposed to the overall system that they need to play a role in driving those solutions that are going to make the biggest dent in the issue. And it is a system level view. And it really only works if enough asset owners have that mindset, because then, to Lucrezia's point on scale, you have enough money flowing to really make that difference that de-risks at the system level. So we see that as well. And so actually that incentive of a team working to maximum carbon abatement in the context of market returns actually again plays to actually addressing system level risk as well. And of course, the final one is that, you know, I am encouraged. We are seeing companies and investors commit to net zero, and therefore say very pragmatically, if we're even to stand a chance of that, we know we have to do this. And so they want our team to feel the same and be incentivized in the same way that their boards are.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And I think we have time for just one last question. So the last question here is, shouldn't ESG and IFRS, et cetera, international organizations work together on how to introduce market prices for renewables or recyclable resources?
So Lucrezia, you'll probably smile when I say this, but one of the things that I realized when, you know, the impact management project was all, as I said, about helping the different organizations that have been working on standards explain the puzzle and how they were pieces of the puzzle and the roles of each of those organizations. And it's now evolved into the hands of the leadership of multilaterals. So the OECD, the UN agencies, the IFC are now governing what is called the impact management platform now. And I really encourage you to go and look at the website. It's got a lot of substance to what I've been saying on that website. But what was really interesting about those conversations is that as that puzzle came into view and people looked at the pieces that the piece that they were playing, the role they were playing, it became really clear which organizations should do what. And it was abundantly clear that actually, if you're, for example, a standard setter focused on disclosure, you cannot play a role in setting a price for carbon. It's a fundamental conflict of interest, and you would find that in the case of financial accounting and other measures that we need in the financial industry. You need to require disclosure of, but you don't actually set it. And that's just one example. I could go on to talk about, again, the roles of the other pieces in relation to each other. So my answer to that question isn't a straightforward one, because yes, I do think international organizations need to come together. And the more we see that happening and them talking to each other, the more we'll see norms, if not, you know, standards and regulation. But we need to be really careful about understanding that who we're asking things of and what their role is in the overall system of frameworks and standards that we need for good management. And I often, the final thing I'll say is I often find what happens is that, and I myself have been guilty of this, is that I want a lot out of disclosure. And sometimes I realize that actually it's the work I've been involved with on corporate purpose, for example, or on fiduciary duty, that is actually the lever that I need to pull versus disclosure. Disclosure responds to it.
Thank you very much, everybody. I mean, we are getting out of time. So Clara, thanks a lot. And thank you very much for helping, and the audience, of course. So thanks for being with us. Just let me remind you that a recording of the webinar will be available soon via the webpage of the Wheeler Institute Climate Initiative and the YouTube channel. And then, you know, I just wanted to remind you the next events. So we have two more in this series. On April 7th, we will have Frédéric Samama. And then our last speaker on April 14th will be Richard Cantor from Moody. Thank you very much, and see you next time.